Welcome to the Concordia Publishing House Podcast, where we consider everything in the light of Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I'm your host, Elizabeth Pittman. Satan lies to us all the time. Our guest today is Pastor Andy Jones. Andy's going to talk with us about how we can recognize 10 of the lies that Satan tells and combat those lies with God's truth. Before we start our conversation with Andy, I'd like to thank our friends at the LCMS Foundation for their support of the podcast. How can your congregation turn significant financial gifts into a long-term funding source that blesses your congregation for years to come? The LCMS Foundation was created to provide professional investment services to LCMS churches, schools, and RSOs. They've helped hundreds of congregations create, manage, and grow endowments using investments tailored to each congregation's unique goals and needs. And now they'd like to help yours. Learn more at lcmsfoundation.org/podcast. Now on to our conversation with Andy Jones. Andy, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here today to talk about the lies that Satan tells us and how we can start to recognize those. Just give us a quick intro to your second book, 10 Lies Satan Loves to Tell.
Sure. So 10 Lies Satan Loves to Tell is all about how Jesus seeks to extract us from the lies of Satan with Jesus' own truth. And it's meant to be a helpful guide for readers to bring them through the various lies that Satan tells God's people, starting in the Garden of Eden to Adam and Eve, and continuing on through the scriptures and into our world today. And it's not just about Satan, as I say, it's not just about the lies, but each chapter concludes with the truth, points you towards Jesus and the gospel, and seeks to free you, liberate you from these lies, because that's what one of the many things that Jesus has come to do is to free us, to liberate us, and to bring us into his kingdom of peace and truth.
Before we go too deeply into a few of the lies, you start the book out in the introduction and you tell us what the book is not. And I think that's really helpful for readers and for our listeners. Give us a little bit about what this book is not about.
Sure. So one of the things that I had, one of the things that I had seen in what I will call similar books is that they spent a lot of time diagnosing the culture around us and diagnosing how Satan was lying to other people, how Satan was lying to their enemies, whether that was politically or religiously or something like that. And I didn't want this to be a book about other people out there, a problem for someone else. Satan's lies are really for all people. He doesn't exempt anyone from his lies. He lies to everyone. And so I really didn't want it to be about others. I wanted the reader to really be able to look at this book as this is about me. This is hitting home for me. And so in structuring the book, I really wanted to talk about my own struggles with these lies, to be vulnerable with that, to help people see like, no, this is something that we all struggle with. And so if someone's coming to this book and looking for a way to point a finger at someone else, it's not going to do that for you. It's going to only point the finger back at yourself. And so it's also not a book that's it's not in the apologetics realm. It's not trying to prove to people that Satan exists. I'm just going from the assumption that Jesus is telling us the truth, that Satan does exist and that he is a liar and the father of lies. So it's not trying to prove anything. It's just trying to assess what Jesus has already told us and what the scriptures have revealed to us.
We know that Satan lies all the time, and we're bombarded with those lies all the time. How did you narrow down all the possible lies that you could have picked from to the 10 that you chose for this book?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because you could write a book that was 1 million lies Satan loves to tell, and you would never run out of them. For me, these 10 in particular were ones that I saw meeting sort of three criteria. I saw Satan using them in his first appearance in the scriptures in Genesis 3. I saw them being repeated through the scriptural narrative, throughout the Bible, characters had to deal with these lies as they lived their lives. And I saw each of these 10 lies being repeated in my own life. And so there are probably more that I could have talked about, but these 10 seem to be the most repeated, and any of the other lies that I could think of sort of found their way under the umbrella of one of these 10.
In lying to us and in getting us to believe the lies that he tells us, what is Satan's outcome in all of this? What is he hoping to achieve?
Yeah, Satan's outcome is diametrically opposed to God's outcome. And so Satan wants us to be as far away from God as possible. Satan wants us to turn from God and just keep walking away from God. He wants us isolated. He wants us to be alone. He wants us to hate everything about God and his kingdom. And the more distance that Satan can create between us and God, the more vulnerable we become to his attacks. Whereas God's outcome, God's desire, is for us to be drawn near to him, for us to be as close to him as possible, for us to not be alone, but to be in community, to be in communion with him and with other fellow believers in Jesus. And so anytime we look at what Satan is up to in the scriptures, we can see him trying to separate us from God. We can see him trying to destroy God's people, lead us into sin and lead us into death. And God's outcome is always the opposite. It is always trying to lead us into forgiveness. It is always trying to lead us into eternal life with him.
You mentioned him wanting to lead us to isolation. One of the lies that you talk about in the book is you are alone. Talk to us about that particular lie and the truth that counteracts that.
Yeah. You are alone is one of those lies that I struggle with personally. Just this feeling of being without anybody's support, like having no net of safety, like you're just sort of free falling and no one is going to catch you. And that feeling of being alone is something that I think we all experience to some degree. And what I think is interesting in my own life, what I found is you can feel alone in any situation, right? Like you can feel alone when you're sitting at home by yourself and no one's around. But you can also feel at home when you're in, a stadium of thousands of people and there's all these people around you, but you can still feel left out. You can feel like you're on your own. You can feel like no one notices you or pays any attention to you. And so it's not a matter of just going and being around people, though that can help. But this feeling of being alone is something that, Satan seeks to attack our thoughts, attack our minds with this idea that even if there are people around us, doesn't matter. You're alone. You're different. For whatever reason, you're not connected to these people in the way that you should be. And one of the main things that Jesus does and repeats and says, and God says throughout the Old Testament when he appears to his people, is he is constantly reminding them of his presence. He's constantly telling them, but I will be with you. And so you think about some of the stories in the Old Testament where people feel alone or feel isolated or what have you, that promise of God's presence is there. So Moses, in Exodus 3, God appears to him in the burning bush, and Moses doesn't want to go do what God sends him to do to free the people from slavery in Egypt. And God says to him, but I will be with you. Gideon, when God appears to him, when the angel of the Lord appears to him and sends him to do the work of freeing them from the Midianites in Judges 6, the angel of the Lord just tells Gideon, but I will be with you. And that reminder keeps coming up again and again. And it's not an accident. Christmas was just celebrated. It's not an accident that when Jesus comes into our world, one of the names that Jesus is given is Emmanuel, which means God with us. And in the incarnation, in Jesus coming into our world, it is God's presence in a new and fantastic way, and that Jesus is here on earth for that brief time of his earthly lifespan is wonderful. But before he ascends into heaven, what does he tell us? I will be with you always. He makes that promise to us. And so God's presence is something that is continually promised throughout the scriptures to God's people. And so one of the reasons why I think you are alone is such an insidious lie is because of how obviously it's not true, of how like almost silly it sounds when you stare at Jesus' words to us that he promises to be with us, and yet we still feel this way. We still feel this aloneness. It is separate from reality. It is separate from the promise that God has given us. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's such a dangerous lie, is because of just how terribly untrue it is.
A lie that I think I've struggled with it. I've seen other people struggle with it. You talk about the lie, your value is based on your performance. Talk to that one, because for so many people, like, our culture is built up that your title matters, how well you parent matters, how well you succeed matters. Mm-hmm. Talk to our value and our performance.
Yeah. This one is tough because, in so much of our world, our performance does dictate the next thing in our life. If you have a job, you probably go through a performance review, right? And maybe your compensation is tied to your performance, and you're not going to get a promotion or get a raise if your performance is lacking. And so it's a piece of our lives. Or if you're still in school and you have to get certain grades in order to stay in school, in order to be able to participate in certain activities. And earn scholarships and all those sorts of things. And so performance is so often tied to our success and the things that we want to accomplish in our lives, that we can really begin to define ourselves by that performance and by that success. And this is something that starts from such an early age, continues on into old age. One of the biggest struggles that I have as a pastor is helping people move through the transition from working to retirement, because there is this identity that has been poured into this job for decades, and all of a sudden there's this change that happens, and people can be so destabilized by not being connected to a job or to a particular workplace, or just feeling like they have no purpose. And what I've found is that it's what a lot of people who retire do is they try to seek purpose in other things. They seek to volunteer, they do all these sorts of things. But for me as a pastor, constantly reminding people that their value is not something that comes from how good they do anything, but their value has been given to them. Their value has been given to them by Jesus. Jesus seeks us out, and he chooses to suffer, die, and rise again for us without any consideration of the merit we have in ourselves. He does this for us, for our salvation, and whether or not we are successful by the world's terms or not, whether or not we have earned that promotion or not, whether or not we get straight A's, it doesn't matter. Jesus has died for you. He has forgiven you. He has chosen you. He has called you by name. He claimed you in the waters of baptism as his own dear child. And your value is based there. It is given to you. It is a gift that you are a part of God's family, God's kingdom. And so, for me at least, there's a freedom to that. It's not that I don't deal with this one. I definitely do. I fall into this trap all the time. But I think it's helpful, especially when you make a mistake, when you fail in some way, and the world's definition of your success is now poor, that's a good time to fall back into, oh yes, my value is not based on my performance. It is based on Jesus. What's difficult is when things are going great to remember my value is not based on my performance either. That the greatness or the success of anything that I have is all gift. It's given by God, and it does not define me. How high your title is, how high your salary is, those things do not define you. Jesus defines you by claiming you as his own beloved child.
It's often been said, or I've heard it said, that social media is the devil's playground. And I think when you see conversations that happen, you see lies and statements that are shared out there, sometimes tend to agree. I think one lie where this does get some play in lots of places, but not just on social media, but is the you deserve more. You need and deserve more.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that.
Yeah. There's something about human existence where we are just never satisfied with what we have. If we're given something, we want more of that something. There's a children's book called "If You Give a Mouse a Cookie," right? If you give a mouse a cookie, he'll ask for a glass of milk, right? And it just keeps going and going and going because there's no way to satisfy this mouse. And we're the same way, And social media, I think, plays into this a little bit. This concept of constantly comparing yourself to other people, and so if you get 5 likes on Facebook, you want 10. If you get 10, you want 50. If you get 50, you want 100. And nothing is ever enough. We always will want more. I think about this with people who, they're like doing upgrades to their house, right? And so, okay, we're going to upgrade the kitchen. Okay, well, now that's done. Okay, now we're going to upgrade the bathroom. Okay, now that's done. Now we're going to upgrade, whatever. There's no end in sight of these upgrades. And some of that is, of course, fine. Like, you are welcome to make those choices. It's the heart issue behind it sometimes that gets in the way for us of just never, ever feeling satisfied with what we have. And if we're constantly chasing more and more and more, then we really fall into the trap of the lie we just talked about, the performance trap. We're just constantly trying to grab onto more and define ourselves by it. And so being able to stop the rat race, so to speak, stop chasing more, and remember what we are told in the scriptures, that God's grace is sufficient for us, that we can bring our prayers before the Lord, our dreams before the Lord, and ask Him, seek, knock. Absolutely, go ahead, do that. But be content with what is given. In the Lord's Prayer, we are told, Jesus teaches us to pray, give us this day our daily bread, give us what we need for this day. We're not told to pray, God, give me more and more and more and more. We're invited into this dependence on God and a trust in Him that He's going to give us what we need. And as we chase more and more, we sort of neglect the wonder and the amazing gift of everything God has given us. We don't pay attention to what has already been placed in our hands. And so I think being able to step back from the lie of more and have some thankfulness and some gratefulness for what God has already given is a huge piece of what it means to follow Jesus.
All of the lies have their problems. Do you think there's a particular lie that is perhaps more dangerous for our culture today than another? That may not be a fair question. But if you had to pull one out that you thought was particularly challenging for us today?
I think in this cultural moment, the fourth lie is life will be better if you seize more control. And it's that lie's all about power. And I think in our cultural moment, we have seen a lot of people who have claimed and grasped that power and abused power. And as God's people, we can look at that and sort of see, okay, well, they're abusing power. What I need to do is I need to step forward and I need to take it away from them. And I need to grab onto more power so that no one can take it away from me. And this sort of back and forth escalation occurs where everyone is just trying to claim as much power as they can all the time. But if we look at what Jesus does with power, it's not seeking more and more. Jesus has all authority in heaven and on earth. And yet what does he choose to do with his power? He allows himself to be arrested and sentenced to death, and he allows himself to suffer and die. He does not, Paul writes in Philippians that Jesus does not count equality with God a thing to be grasped at. Jesus lays down his power. I often think about what Jesus does in the upper room, the night before he dies, and washing his disciples' feet. He chooses to do this task that is so demeaning in that culture. He chooses to wash their feet and chooses to humble himself, to lower himself. And I think for us, as we deal with this cultural moment, we have to be looking to Jesus and his example of what it looks like to handle power. And what it often looks like with Jesus is giving dignity to other people and recognizing their humanity and allowing other people even to harm you so as not to abuse power. It's a complicated one, and I've been working on a presentation with my friend Shelley for best practices next month on this topic of power, and it's something that is really hard to speak to, just because sometimes the desire for power comes from this place of like wanting to help, wanting to do good, wanting to make sure that you protect people and provide for them and things like that. And yet we often get drawn into a cycle that is so unhealthy and unhelpful. And just being aware of that, and it's good to help, it's good to protect people, it's good to use one's power and steward it for the good of God's kingdom. Oh, but it's such a trap in our world today, and we just have to be so careful.
There are more lies that we could cover, but we'll let you read the book for that. What can we do, besides spending time reading your book, to arm ourselves to recognize the lies and to combat them in our daily lives?
Yeah, that's a good question. Part of recognizing the lies is being familiar with the truth. It is much easier to recognize a lie when you know what is true. And the place where you find what is true is you look into God's Word. And one of the things in the book that I provide is, in the very back, there's just a really quick sheet, like one pager of each lie, the truth that Jesus tells us, and a quick Bible verse to remind you of that truth. And I think just looking at that page, looking up those Bible verses, remembering that those things are true and not the lie that Satan keeps telling you, immersing yourself more and more in the words of eternal life and the words of Jesus, you will begin to recognize more quickly when a lie is coming at you, because you know what the truth is. And the difference between a truth and a lie is, it's night and day. It's so different. And so the more familiar you are with the language of Jesus and what he says, the easier it is to recognize, that doesn't sound right. That thing that just popped into my head, that sounds like the opposite of Jesus. And so the more connected you are to Jesus and his word, I don't know if easier is the right word, but hopefully the more quickly you'll be able to recognize when the lie comes at you, because nothing's going to stop the lies. Satan's going to keep lying to everyone. That's his native language. That is what he does best. So being able to recognize as quickly as possible, that's a lie. Let me set that aside and move back into the truth.
How do you envision readers using this book? I think there's a number of ways that it could be used, but how, in an ideal scenario, how do you picture the readers using this book?
Yeah, I think my hope would be that this would be read in community. One of the biggest dangers that we face from Satan is he seeks to isolate us. And so I don't want someone to go through this and feel terrible about themselves and not have anyone uplifting them, So I think ideally what I would love to see is people choosing to read this in a group setting, sort of book club-ish, where you gather together, 3, 4, 10 friends, whatever. You work your way through the book, and then at the end of every chapter, there's questions for reflection, and there's also some scripture verses to meditate on. And I think if people can read this together and they can reflect on those questions together, that will allow some vulnerability, but also some support and some constant reminders from God's people. Yep, I've fallen for that lie countless times, but let's remember the truth of this. And so for me, this being read in community would be a delightful thing to see. Of course, you can read it on your own, but I would encourage anyone who chooses to read it on their own, always surround yourself with support of other people. Never isolate yourself. Always seek to be as connected with God's people as possible.
And I noticed in a couple of early reader reviews, the book was compared to C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. What do you think about that?
I was surprised by that, just because that's one of those books that I hold up as this is solid gold. And so trying to put myself on that level is I'm not there. So I was honored by it, but I was also very surprised. It is very different stylistically. The Screwtape Letters it's a fictional work, and it's letters from a demonic force to another demonic force, and it's really sort of playing out the strategy and game plan of what Satan is up to in his kingdom. And so in that way, I can see some overlap in that, Lewis really draws out the strategy, and I'm sort of more pointing out the strategy in a nonfiction way. I think the one way that I will say the overlap is true is that C.S. Lewis had remarked after writing the Screwtape letters that there was not a book that he'd ever written that he got less enjoyment from. It was just not fun to put yourself into the devil's mind, and it was hard for him to write in a way, but also very easy to write because I think the way he said it was, once you have the idea for these diabolical letters, it just sort of writes itself. You just put yourself in the mind of the devil, which is hard on a person. And so I think for me, that resonated with me. And so when I even started writing this book 2 years ago, I gathered some of the best praying people I know and said, hey, I'm going to be writing this from 6 to 8 o'clock every day. Would you please pray for me during that time to get me through this? And I gave them regular updates on how it was going. I'm taking a break, I'm coming back to it now, that sort of thing. And then they get a big shout out in the book, acknowledgments for helping me through that. Just because I recognize that trying to put yourself in the mind of the devil it's not a fun place to be. And so, I'm happy with what I wrote, but there are times when I go back and look at it and I'm like, I don't really remember that one. I don't remember what was going on when I had this insight. It just sort of spun past me. And so in that way, I'll say, thanks for those comparisons. I appreciate it, friends. But it's really more it is similar in that it connects to the strategy of Satan and it tries to expose that. Yes, there's a similarity.
So as we wrap up, tell us a little bit about how 10 Lies Satan Loves to Tell connects to your first book, 10 Questions to Ask Every Time You Read the Bible.
Sure. I think the two books are up to a similar thing in that they're trying to point you deeper into the words of Jesus. They're trying to get you to open the scriptures and to connect to the biblical narrative. In my mind, I have a sort of a 3-part series that's dealing with spirituality for Christian people, and the concept comes from Martin Luther. In one of his writings, he's talking about Psalm 119, and what Luther sees in that psalm is this sort of cycle that occurs in the Christian life. He calls it oratio, meditatio, tentatio, which is 3 Latin phrases, which mean oratio means prayer, meditatio means meditation on the scriptures, and tentatio is suffering the assaults of the devil. And so the first book, 10 Questions, was really all about that meditatio concept, the middle concept of asking questions, meditating on the scriptures, letting the scriptures wash over you, and just spending time with them and learning more and more about who God is and who we are to him. But the thing about, studying the scriptures and praying is that when we do those things, this counterintuitive thing occurs in the life of Christians where we're attacked. We're attacked by Satan with anything he can throw at us, but Satan's favorite tool, it seems, is to lie to us. And so this book connects to the first book in that as we're reading the scriptures, what happens is Satan attacks us. And after Satan attacks us, God uses that attack to drive us back to himself, drive us back to prayer and scripture. And that is how God uses the attack. While Satan uses it to separate us, God uses it to draw us back to himself. And so my hope would be that a third book hopefully is in the works that has to do with a third concept of prayer.
Well, we'll look forward to that. So for our listeners, if you check out the links in our show notes, you'll be able to learn more about 10 Lies Satan Loves to Tell and Andy's first book, 10 Questions to Ask Every Time You Read the Bible. Andy, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Have a good one.
We'll see you next time, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Concordia Publishing House Podcast. I pray that this time was valuable to your walk with Christ. We'd love to connect with listeners on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Concordia Pub. Visit cph.org for more resources to grow deeper in the gospel.